Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Fantasy Football Friday on Spartan Fantasy Football. My name is Steven Psihogios, and I'm going to be breaking down all the latest news and notes from the world of the NFL and translating it into fantasy football. And let's start with the big news of the day today. We could have gone a couple of ways. We could have started with the Justin Jefferson news, but I'll touch on that later. We'll start with Josh Allen. This guy right here signed a monstrous 6-year 45 or $43 million per season contract with the Buffalo Bills that'll kick in at the start of the 2023 season. That puts him just a couple $1 million behind what Patrick Mahomes is making, which is $45 million per year. But from a Buffalo Bills standpoint, I think it's a genius move. From a dynasty standpoint, you've got to be thrilled that Allen is going to be staying in Buffalo throughout the course of his contract. That continuity, going back, staying with the Bills is great. Stephon Diggs isn't going anywhere anytime soon. He's 28 years old, but he's one of these receivers, Diggs, that I think is going to age really well. He's a smaller receiver, hasn't really been plagued thoroughly with injuries. So I'd say from a dynasty fantasy football standpoint, Allen re-signing with the Bills, that extension is great news. And like I said, from the Bills standpoint, I think this is a genius contract. We know that quarterback contracts just go through the roof year after year after year. They're not something that once there is a limit set, everything falls underneath. We've had the Mahomes deal, which has set a limit for a year. He signed that extension last year at $45 million per season. Allen now is making 43. So that gap has been closed. When he first signed it, it was a $10 million gap between what Russell Wilson was making at $35 million and what Mahomes signed for at $45 million. Since then, Deshaun Watson, $39 million. Dak Prescott, $40 million. And now Josh Allen signs at $43 million. So we're seeing a gap really close now between where Mahomes signed last year and this year. And that's why I think the Allen contract is genius for the Bills. It's only going to age better. You have the Browns and the Ravens, both from that 2018 draft class, need to re-sign or extend, rather, Lamar Jackson and Baker Mayfield. So when you look at it, getting ahead of the game helps because now you don't have to use one of either Mayfield or Jackson's contracts as the bar for how you want to negotiate the Allen deal. They've got it done. They set the standard. Let Baltimore and Cleveland worry about how their contracts are going to align with the Allen deal. So I thought that was a great move for the Bills. And like I said, for Dynasty Fantasy Football, you got to be happy. Diggs doesn't look like he's going anywhere anytime soon. Gabriel Davis is a nice young emerging wide receiver. And that Bills front office has just proven that they can put talent around Josh Allen. It took a couple of years at the beginning since they brought him in, but now you look at Allen. He's a game breaker, difference maker, top 3 quarterback in fantasy football, being paid as the second highest quarterback in the NFL right now. Like I said, that'll probably change by the time it actually even kicks in 2023. Moving to Justin Jefferson, they're saying he's dealing with an AC joint sprain, which is good news. The early indications seemed like it was going to be something more serious, but I believe an AC joint sprain is just medical terminology for a shoulder sprain. So that's good news for Justin Jefferson. He doesn't sound like he's going to miss a large chunk of time. It is a little concerning, though. Nobody likes dealing with injuries in the first place. So that'll be something to monitor if it lingers. But I think with rest, he'll be fine. Preseason reps, now that he's in his second year, aren't as important as they were a year ago for him when he was just getting into the NFL, getting familiar with Kirk Cousins and the Minnesota Vikings offense. So I don't think it's a major loss by any stretch if he misses a little bit of training camp time. So good news, I'd say, on the Justin Jefferson front. Also, if you have any questions, takeaways, observations you want to let me know about, hit me up in the chat. I'm always reading the chat. Love to hear what you have to say as well. So, but with regards to the Jefferson news, I'd take it as positive news. And until we have reason to be concerned, I wouldn't get overly concerned. I still have him inside my top 8 at wide receiver. I still think that that is a player that I'm going to try and draft. And if I can get a discount on him now, even better. So I'm not overly concerned about this injury of Justin Jefferson. Had it been something more serious, obviously we would have had to deal with it from there, but it's not. So I'm not freaking out right now. Next up in the news stories from today, Trequan Smith has been dealing with a leg injury, apparently, and Marquez Callaway has been relishing in the opportunity to be the alpha receiver. Callaway has the size you like to see from a number one. He has the speed you also like to see from a number one. So I think there is some interest here with Marquez Callaway. I would be very interested in trying to draft him in the later rounds of my draft. I think this news is going to push him up a little bit more in fantasy football drafts, but I still think it could be worth it. The Michael Thomas injury situation is going to be in flux. It's not like Trequan Smith was this established player in the Saints offense. He's had opportunities to emerge as a solid number two or number three, and he hasn't been able to do it. So now that Callaway is getting that opportunity at the start of the season, I'm interested. I'm interested in Marquez Callaway. If you can get him 10th round or later, I think that's good value. And you're going to get him a lot later right now in fantasy football drafts. So Marquez Callaway, number one wide receiver on the Saints. We still don't know who the quarterback is going to be there in New Orleans. It could be Taysom Hill. It could be Jameis Winston. We don't know. It'll be one of those two guys. And all we do know, though, is that A, Alvin Kamara is looking like he's in for a massive workload now that Michael Thomas is gone. And B, we're also looking like Marquez Callaway is going to be the number one wide receiver. Also, hey, I'll throw in a third option there. Option number C, I like Adam Troutman too. I think he's going to really benefit from the lack of competition now in the target division of this team. Michael Thomas dealing with injury. Who knows if Trequan Smith will be ready on time, and who knows what kind of role he's even going to have. I think Troutman could easily develop into the number one or number two option in that passing game. So something to keep in mind for fantasy football. He's going around like tight end 15 or later in fantasy football drafts. If you're waiting on tight end, there's not too many young dynamic players going in that range that are going to have such a clear path to targets like Adam Troutman. So Troutman, another name to file away, saying, if I got to look for a guy at the end of my draft, or if I'm going to wait on tight end, this is the guy that I should have queued up and should try to target in my draft. Because I really have come around on Adam Troutman, especially after the Michael Thomas news. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. And speaking of tight ends, Darren Waller missing 3 straight practices this week. We still don't know why. It's been undisclosed. Again, one of these situations where no need to be concerned until we actually have reason to be concerned. But, missing 3 practices is a big deal. So we'll see what happens with Darren Waller. I'm not adjusting the rankings just yet when it comes to Darren Waller, but it is something to be a little concerned about in fantasy football. Lastly, I want to talk about the Hall of Fame game from last night. So we saw a pretty healthy dosage of Najee Harris. He had 7 carries for 22 yards, was bottled up for the most part, wasn't the most impressive of efforts, but first game of the year, it's going to take him a little bit of time. Jonathan Taylor really kind of showed us that it does take rookie running backs a little bit of time to find their groove in the NFL. He showed us that last year. So maybe don't be so quick to rush moving Harris down in your rankings. I would err more on the side of, it was just one preseason game. This isn't something that I should be rushing to make a make or break portion of my draft. I would just leave it aside. One thing that did concern me, and I actually, from looking at it today, I haven't seen really much news on it. I've got it right here. I haven't seen anybody report on it, was Chase Claypool exiting the game last night, because he looked like he banged up his shoulder. I just want to do a quick search here while I'm on. Chase Claypool, I know, made that big 45-yard grab and then all of a sudden was out of the game. So let's see if there's any injury updates on him. I haven't seen anything really so far. So I guess it's still wait and see with Chase Claypool, but that was a little concerning, especially if you have Claypool, if you've drafted him in one of your leagues already or you have him in Dynasty, I'd be a little concerned. Like, that is a guy who looked the part as a number one wide receiver in the NFL last year. He's got the big frame, he's got the big speed, he's got everything you really want as far as wide receivers go. And he was a total mismatch in the red zone for opposing teams. Him leaving the game looked like he banged up his shoulder a little bit on that grab. I'd be a little nervous drafting him in fantasy football till we get a news update. Just seeing that happen live in action made me a little bit concerned about the status of Chase Claypool. So that's something else to keep in mind. As far as risers or fallers in my rankings this week, one guy who did rise because of some injury news was Jaylen Rager. Also, he showed out in practice. I don't know if you saw that catch he made yesterday. It's just one catch. I know. Let's not get too crazy about it. But I thought it was a really great grab. And Devonta Smith's been dealing with an injury in training camp. So something just to file away. We also heard this week Jaylen Waddle has been dealing with an injury in training camp. And so had Will Fuller. But he's back. And Fuller is someone that I would throw back up in the rankings, and especially if Waddle's going to miss time. I think that gives Fuller a little bit more intrigue as to where he's going, because the issue that I have with this Miami Dolphins offense is that I think it's almost too redundant having Fuller and Waddle in the same offense. They're the same player, basically. Both are field stretchers, dynamic, big play guys, and having them both in the offense, I feel like they're going to take away from each other more than they're going to benefit each other. It's not like a situation where you've got one guy who can stretch the field and the other guy can get open underneath. They're both kind of guys who stretch the field and make their living downfield in the receiving game. So we'll see how that goes. I'm going to leave the stream up a little bit longer here. If you have any questions, observations, takeaways from this past week in fantasy football, let me know. I'm all ears. But yeah, the Claypool news, that was, or the injury rather, wasn't news. We still haven't heard anything yet with regards to Claypool. We'll see what happens there. But again, still don't want to overreact until we have something concrete to go off of. Just looking here. Yeah, I thought this was a silly news piece today. Was Shanahan saying that they're going to use Trey Lance situationally? That's not going to take long for that to turn into they're going to use Trey Lance in every situation. You don't trade up what the 49ers traded up in the draft to have that guy that you used with the pick sit on the bench. So it's not going to take long for Trey Lance to get in as the starter. Jimmy Garoppolo has clear limitations. Trey Lance has clear upside. You don't make that move unless you're ready to make a switch at quarterback. I think Kyle Shanahan's bluffing at this. They said they're going to give him some first team reps after he said he wasn't going to give him some first team reps, but he said now situationally, look, I'm not buying what Kyle Shanahan's selling. If he starts the year with Jimmy Garoppolo over Trey Lance, that's going to look bad on the organization for going with the guy who they've replaced already. What's the whole point of replacing him if you're just going to keep starting him? I understand, maybe the rookie doesn't look ready, but by all accounts, Lance has looked good in training camp, and we know what Jimmy Garoppolo is at this point. He's not coming to camp a completely different person. So I thought that was a little silly bit of news. Lamar Jackson activated from the COVID reserve list. So there was that. James Washington wants to trade. That's a guy in Dynasty who would be interesting because I don't think Washington's played that bad. It's a crowded wide receiver room in Pittsburgh, and he's been relegated to wide receiver 4 duties, and you can't argue that he deserves to be on the field over Juju Smith-Schuster, Claypool, or Deontay Johnson. So really, I could see a trade to a wide receiver needy team really helping him. Maybe even a team like the Patriots could be a potential fit. Although I don't know what that relationship is like now between the Steelers and the Patriots. We obviously knew when Tom Brady was there and both teams were the class of the AFC that there wasn't a whole lot of buddy-buddy between those two teams. But maybe now that we've got the Steelers trending in one direction and the Patriots kind of trying to bounce back after last year, no longer the class of the AFC, either of those teams, maybe they can make something work. So there was that bit of news. Just looking over Julio Jones missing time with a leg injury, but it's nothing major. So wouldn't get too worried about that until you have to. Nico Collins, here's an interesting one, especially in dynasty leagues, getting reps with the first team, seeing healthy dosage of reps with the first team. That is a player who is in a very open wide receiver room. Like there's Brandon Cooks. They have Nico Collins, who they drafted. They just traded Randall Cobb. That's a very non-elite, non-talented wide receiver room. There's no depth really in that wide receiver room in Houston. I could see Nico Collins making a few big plays. That was his thing. He was able to get downfield as a big body receiver at Michigan. I could see him doing very similar things in Houston. And this is going to be an offense that's going to be playing from behind almost every single game. There's probably not many games when you project it out where the Houston Texans are going to be playing with a lead after halftime. They're going to be down and down bad early. So Nico Collins could be a nice little dart throw, even in redraft leagues. Just looking at some other news, the Carson Wentz news, I talked about that last week. Aaron Rodgers news, talked about that last week. We still don't know what's going to happen with Deshaun Watson. And I mean, with all of the extra stuff with the sexual assault allegations against him, which are very serious and should be treated as such by the NFL, and prospecting NFL teams looking into a potential deal with Deshaun Watson, I don't see where a trade works, especially if you're Houston. There's really no point in trading him now. It's very late in the offseason to make a deal that big. And also, there's a lot of uncertainty with all of these cases against Deshaun Watson. How can you expect, if you're the Houston Texans, someone to give you full value for Deshaun Watson when his playing future is still very uncertain with all of this news surrounding him? So I don't expect a deal to happen there. The Dak Prescott injury, he's expected to be back by week 1. They're saying it's under the armpit, so it's more like I guess in his lat. They're saying it's more of a baseball injury. I got no idea what that means, if I'm being completely honest with you. I don't know how something could be more of a baseball injury, but that was the report that Jay Glazer gave. So take with that what you will. Just checking to see if there's anything I missed, anything that slipped between the cracks. If you can think of something, let me know in the chat. Love to answer that as well. Cliff Kingsbury was talking about how he views Rondale Moore as a slot receiver, an inside receiver, and Andy Isabella as an outside receiver. So if you're an Andy Isabella truther in Dynasty, that's some good news. He's not competing with Rondale Moore for a job, but that's still a crowded wide receiver room with AJ Green there now. They still have Moore, Kirk, Hopkins, Isabella. Isabella's probably the 5th guy on that list, maybe 4th, depending on how things shake out between he and AJ Green. So it's, if you're truthering Andy Isabella soon, it might be time to give it up soon. There was the Kenny Goliday injury. Didn't talk about this one. This came out yesterday. He's going to miss probably 2 to 3 weeks. And that is a little concerning, especially when you're dealing with a soft tissue injury like the hamstring. Hamstring injuries tend to linger. You've heard this before. Hamstring injuries are a pain in the ham. They are awful. And nobody wants to go through a hamstring injury because of how hard it is to rehabilitate it. And especially when you're an NFL player who's going to use their hamstring on literally every single play, it's hard to really rest that properly, especially when you're in a time crunch to get ready for the NFL season. That is someone who I'm starting to stay away from in fantasy football. I haven't adjusted the rankings just yet with Goliday, but I'd imagine he's going to really fall back in my rankings. He's hovering around number 25 wide receiver in my rankings. That's probably going to change. I'm probably going to have to bump him outside the top 30. Just really concerned about that injury and not having that time to gain a report with Daniel Jones is a question mark. That is now an issue. It's a strike against Kenny Goliday, and I probably won't end up with much of him on my team, if any, in fantasy football this season. But I think that covers most of the big news. So if you got any last-second questions, takeaways, observations, let me know in the chat. I'll leave it open for another minute and a half. We'll get to that 20-minute mark, and then I'll sign off. But not a bad week this week in the NFL for injuries. We didn't have a game-breaking injury like the Cam Akers one, which we got a couple weeks ago. Didn't have a season ender like that or a massive injury like the one we had to Michael Thomas. Just a few weeks here and there. Stuff that might end up being more of an issue than it is at least currently stated to be right now. So not a horrible week really for injuries. So we'll take it because we know in this vicious game of fantasy football, injuries are awful and they come often. So that was a positive from this week. And just looking at the rest of the news, doesn't seem like all that much going on in the NFL. We had the Allen extension, good move for the Bills. Happy about that in Dynasty. I have Allen in a Dynasty league that I'm in. I'm thrilled about him staying in Buffalo. Also, I'm a Bills fan. So nice to have some quarterback stability after years, literally my life of cheering for the Bills and having none. It's nice. It's nice. Trequan Smith injury, Justin Jefferson, Marquez Callaway looking good, Darren Waller. That's basically the news of the day, and I touched into some of the news of the week earlier as well. So If you like what you saw, follow me on Twitter at Steven Zahoyas. I bring similar content and information. I'm going to be doing these every Friday throughout the NFL season. And once the regular season starts, I'm going to ramp up how many of these I do. Probably going to do a pregame show as well on Sunday. So look forward to that. And that's going to do it for this episode of Fantasy Football Friday. Thanks so much for tuning in. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you all again on next Friday.